Here's another popular argument for the existence of God that, if you're anything like me, you're tired of hearing. Without God, there can be no objective, absolute moral standard. Morality cannot be man-made. It must come from God. This argument is old and not very compelling, but it is extremely useful in illustrating a fundamental difference between my philosophy and the philosophy of many religious people I've encountered in this conversation. See, I don't just think that our morality comes from ourselves rather than from God. I don't understand why we should want it to be any other way. First things first, why shouldn't we believe that our morality comes from God? Well, the smart-ass atheist answer is to say that there's no reason to believe there even is a God to begin with, and if there is no God, we can hardly have gotten our morality from him. But that's not a very productive answer to this argument. After all, creationists cite the very existence of morality as proof for God. Who else but God, so goes the claim, could have given us our inner moral sense? Why else would we just innately know that things like murder and theft and rape were wrong? Why else would we feel compelled to help the poor or the sick when we don't stand to benefit from our generosity? Why else would it just feel so good to be good? Well, you can answer all of those questions without resorting to God. There are natural explanations for morality, for why humans have a conscience, for why we feel compelled to help people even though we don't stand to benefit from our actions ourselves. It's actually relatively easy to explain, at least in very broad terms. Humans are social animals. The animals we evolved from were social animals. We've always lived in society with one another. We largely refrain from killing and robbing and raping and lying to each other because if we didn't, we wouldn't last very long. There are also deeper physiological foundations underlying our innate feelings of respect and compassion and kindness toward one another. Most animals exhibit what's called kin selection. That's where an individual is compelled to go to great lengths to protect a close genetic relative from harm, even at the cost of the individual's own life. Biologically speaking, the only reason for any organism to exist is to pass its genetic material on to the next generation. So it only makes sense that we feel compelled to protect our close relatives because they share most of our genetic material. So long as we're talking about the evolutionary advantages of morality, let's not forget the value of genetic variation. The larger and more diverse a population is, the more possible genetic combinations it has, and therefore the stronger its gene pool. It just makes sense for us to want to help each other instead of kill each other because, genetically speaking, the more of us there are, the stronger we are. These explanations help to demonstrate that we don't need God to teach us right from wrong. And there are still more reasons to believe that human morality is far from divine. As we all know, there are those of us, thankfully not many of us, who are born without that inner moral sense, who are capable of committing acts of cruelty against their fellow creatures without that feeling of guilt or shame that would stop many of us from doing that. If we believe that morality comes to us from God, it's difficult to explain why God would choose to create certain individuals capable of unrepentantly torturing or slaughtering his or her fellow creatures. If, on the other hand, we accept that our morality, like every other part of us, is the product of a natural process of evolution, then it makes sense that it would be lacking in some of us. We wouldn't expect God to make mistakes, but evolution screws up all the time. But without God to tell you, how do you know what is right and what is wrong? I can imagine some of you asking. If you don't believe in God and you say that murder is wrong, or rape is wrong, or theft is wrong, you're just stating an opinion. Without God, there are no moral absolutes. Fair enough. The thing is, when a Christian, for example, argues that without God there are no moral absolutes, he's not really making an argument for the existence of God. There's no support in that argument for the existence of God. There's really no reason why we would expect there to be objective moral absolutes. That's an argument for how you think the world ought to be, not an argument for how the world is. It's like arguing that Santa Claus must exist because without him, we'd have to buy all these presents ourselves. Which brings me to the second part of my response to the moral argument. Why would we want God to dictate our morality anyway? I don't understand why religion places such high value on having important things like morality and purpose handed down to us from on high. Never mind that there's no reason to believe that ever actually happened. Why would we want it to happen? Isn't it better that our morality comes from us, from our instincts, from our cultures? Doesn't the fact that we decided for ourselves that robbing and raping and murdering and torturing and lying were wrong count for anything? No omnipotent father figure had to come down and tell us to behave. We decided, as cultures, as societies, in large measure as a species, to treat each other with compassion and kindness, to embrace and tolerate differences, to respect each other's rights. We don't do these things because we have to, in order to avoid angering our Creator. We do them because we want to. There's another reason to be glad that our morality comes from us instead of from God. Because it's the product of a process of natural evolution, like life, morality can grow and change over time. Certain morals seem to have been established fairly early on, almost universally. For instance, we know of no human society that ever thrived while condoning murder or theft. Others seem to have taken a bit longer to catch on. For instance, slavery was widely tolerated for thousands of years in almost every human society, including the one that produced the Old Testament. Women, gays, ethnic minorities, and other outgroups have often been subjected to discrimination and outright cruelty. Slavery and institutionalized bigotry have been widely abolished throughout the Western world, but only relatively recently. And there are still parts of the world where these practices go on today, often at the hands of people who claim to be acting with a divine mandate. Moral revolutions like the one that brought about the end of slavery are only possible because our morality does not come from some remote, unmovable authority. Religious folks often ask, if God doesn't decide what's right and wrong, who does? Well, we do, all of us, as cultures, as societies, ever increasingly as a species, shaping and changing and redirecting those physiological moral impulses I mentioned earlier is a continuous, global conversation, a dialectic in which every thinking human being participates, whether they know it or not, that decides what is moral and what is immoral and which rights ought to be protected and at what price. Imagine for a moment that the metaphysical claims of the Bible were true, that our morality really was handed down to us by the Judeo-Christian God from his heavenly throne. Slavery would still be practiced all over the world, with slaves admonished to work hard for their masters. Women would be treated as currency for men to barter with. Criminals found guilty of even the most minor infractions of church law would be swiftly and brutally executed. There would be no such thing as separation of church and state, no secular civil government, and the most monstrous crimes imaginable, genocide, infanticide, would be permitted so long as they were done in the name of God. We should all be very, very grateful that the Bible is a work of man-made mythology and not divine revelation. The God of the Bible is the worst moral example I can possibly imagine. And most modern Jews and Christians seem to agree with me, whether or not they recognize it consciously or admit it. Most religious people I know are actually very good moral people. They don't stone others for breaking commandments. They'd never condone genocide. And I hardly ever catch them having to look at the Ten Commandments to remind themselves that it's wrong to kill or to steal or to lie. They're not good people because they live according to the teachings of the Bible. They're good people because they know which teachings of the Bible to ignore. Most of you who began watching this video believing that morality was proof of God's existence that only God could have given us our inner sense of right and wrong, probably still believe that. I doubt I've persuaded many of you. But as I said at the top, this argument is most useful for delineating the difference between my philosophy and that of most Christians. All the Christians I know believe that morality without God is weak and meaningless. But myself, I'm very happy to live in a world where we, as a society, get to make our own rules, rather than just having to accept those handed down to us by a severe, remote, supernatural father. Maybe some of you like having moral questions already answered for you. You like not having to think too hard, being able to remain a child your whole life. Me, I'm happy to be a grown-up. And it's just as well, because whether we realize it or not, none of us have a choice. We're on our own.